Shalom. First and foremost, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Recha Kodash. Double honors to the elders and the apostles of Great Millstone, and peace and blessings to the elect. And today we're going to go into the book of Isaiah, the 53rd chapter, the suffering servant. And this chapter is concerning Yahushai, the Messiah, and the things that he had to suffer for the sake of Israel, okay, having been offered up as a sacrifice that his blood may cover, the sins of Israel, and they can be reconciled back to the Father. And so this is the book of Isaiah. Now, in Isaiah, the 52nd chapter, right, Isaiah began to speak about Yahushua, getting to the latter part of that chapter, leading into this chapter here. So this is Isaiah 53:1. Who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord Yahweh revealed? And Isaiah said this to signify that you would have a lot of people when Yahushua would come on the scene that would not believe in him, and they would not believe his doctrine, who he was, and ultimately they wouldn't regard him as the Messiah. Okay, which here in Isaiah he's known as the arm of the Lord. Right. So who hath believed our report, and to whom is the arm of the Lord revealed? Right, and this is asked because there are so few in comparison to the majority that actually believed on the report of Yahushua and on him. And this is, referenced in the book of John, chapter 12. And I'll just get straight to the point. Verse 37. But though he had done so many miracles before them, yet they believed not on him. And the one who had done these miracles was Yahushua. But the people still did not believe upon him. Not everyone, but a good portion of them. That the saying, so the reason why they did not believe upon him, was so that the saying of Isaiah the prophet might be fulfilled, which he spake, Lord, who hath believed our report, and to whom hath the arm of the Lord been revealed? See, and you say this this question is not a question that is begging an actual answer, but it's a question that, in just asking the question alone, you're sort of proving a point of how few there are that actually believed on the Lord, and it was revealed to them that Yahushua was here, as he's likened unto the arm of the Lord. Verse 2, for he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. All right, and referring to Yahushua, and ultimately the mission that the Lord sent Yahushua on required him to come on the earth in the form of a mortal man, like everybody else, basically like an ordinary man, though he had spiritual power, and we knew he was more than ordinary. But that was something that you needed to see in the spirit in order to believe it, right? It wouldn't be something that you would believe on just because of the outward glory. And so, as it likened him onto a tender plant, but also a root out of a dry ground, when you look at a dry ground, it doesn't look like ground that is or earth that is conducive to life. All right, and spiritually, that also signified the state that Israel was in. All right, being subject to the Romans, but also in a spiritual sense, being lost. That's why Yahushua had to, the Lord sent him at that time. I forget which chapter we went through, but in one of the chapters in Isaiah, the Lord mentioned, right, at a matter of fact, let me just see if I can find it. Let me see, have I helped thee? There we go, Isaiah 49:8. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, in an acceptable time have I heard thee, and in a day of salvation have I helped thee, and I will preserve thee, and give thee for a covenant of the people, to establish the earth, to cause to inherit the desolate heritages. So that acceptable time and that day of salvation started when the Lord deemed it necessary to send Yahushua back on the scene, right? And the Apostle Paul reiterates this in his writings. So back in Isaiah 53 verse 2, continuing, he hath no form nor comeliness. When something is comely, it's like it's beautiful, right? It's pleasant to look upon. Let's look into that word, chadar, right? Ornament, splendor, honor, glory, majesty. So when Yahushua was on the earth over 2,000 years ago, he didn't come in a glorious form. He didn't come in a majestic form. He came in the form of what people would consider like an ordinary man. And when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. So there wasn't anything that outside of the spirit stood out about Yahushua, you could say, right? From the eyes of the carnal Israelites, that would attract them to listen to him and to believe him, right? Because from their perspective, with what they had heard about the Messiah and what he would do, they were likely expecting something more similar to what he's going to do when he comes back this time. And so having been presented with the Yahushua, who some saw as a kid grow up amongst them, knew his family, to them there was nothing special enough to make them say, yeah, I'm something is drawing me to believe on him. Right? He's just another ordinary guy, son of a carpenter. But those that were in the spirit, the Lord had opened up their eyes to where they could see that that wasn't the case. But for the majority, it wasn't so. And the Lord did that because Yahushua, when he came on the scene at that time, wasn't there to, to basically enjoy glory, right? He was there to be a sacrifice. Verse 3, he is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. So Isaiah is seeing these things and prophesying these things concerning Yahushua, which we know because when you read the Gospels, you see that this is what Yahushua had to go through. There were obviously, it wasn't everybody that didn't believe in the Lord, but there were a great deal of individuals that did not believe in the Lord, that rejected him, that despised him. Hence, they called him, what was that? They basically said that he was casting out demons, with left hand power. Slakia. As it says here, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Yeah, because Yahushua had a heavy burden on him when he came as Yahushua to fulfill that role. Not only knowing what he had to suffer, but also seeing the condition of his people. The scriptures tell you that he wept, right? There were different accounts when Yahushua wept, seeing the state that Israel were in and knowing what was about to happen to them, but also knowing that he didn't have really much of a choice or an option to turn down the cup that was before him. He had to drink that. So he was pressed. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. And in other words, it's like saying we turned our backs to him, or backs on him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Right? And when Isaiah says we, he's speaking from a nationalistic level. Right? Sometimes when the majority of the nation do something, it's likened on to, when you say we, you really speak from the tense of the majority. So the majority of Israel esteemed not Yahushua. Surely he hath borne our griefs, and the word borne there means to carry. When something is airborne, it's carried through the air or carried through the wind. So as it says in verse 4, right, he has carried or borne our griefs, And the griefs go into the sufferings and and so on. But how did the Lord bear that? Because the sufferings that Israel were going through was because of their iniquity. But Yahushua carried that iniquity upon him and became a sacrifice for that. As it says, and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. So, in other words, they didn't understand or esteem Yahushua as being, a sacrifice for their redemption, right? And his blood to be, by which way we would be delivered, because the Lord was providing us another way through Yahushua. But rather, it was more so like when they saw the harsh condition Yahushua had to go through. You had some that just considered it as, oh yeah, that's just judgment for him just doing something, right? He was stricken, right, or smitten of God and afflicted, so he was just getting judged for something he did. Now, technically, right, spiritually, and when you read in the scriptures, it tells you that he would have to suffer the stripes of men, right, because of the iniquity, if he committed any, as Solomon, which he did. Okay, but the main focus of Yahushua coming on the scene to die and in that way was to be a sacrifice for the nation, right, starting with his elect. But majority of them did not recognize it as so. It's like you're going through, major lengths to do something for someone, and here it is. They're not even. It's not even just that they're not appreciating it. They're coming against you while you're doing it. It's crazy. Verse 5, but he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. And the Lord did that so that we would have a chance. This is why we have a chance through Yahushua, because had Yahushua not been our help, we would have had to pay that. We would have had to bear our own iniquities and be bruised for our own transgressions and wounded for, and we wouldn't stand. So rather than that, the Lord brought Yahushua as really mercy, a token of mercy. The chastisement of our peace was upon him. Now, what's meant by the chastisement of our peace is, the punishment that would lead to our peace, because by Yahushua enduring that, we now have a way to peace, a way to salvation. But had he not done that, we would have been cooked, which is why the Apostle John wept when he saw that there was no man able to loose the seals of the book. But guess what? Yahushua was able to. So, as we're reading, where is it at? Yeah, the chastisement of our peace was upon him. So he endured that chastening so that we may have a chance at that peace, at that salvation. And with his stripes we are healed. Right? And physically, right, he was whipped, he was beaten. He received the stripes. And he did that so we could gain that healing. We could have that spirit sent down upon us to open up our minds, to understand the scriptures, to have the way of righteousness opened back to us again. Remember, in 2nd Esdras, it tells you that the paths were made narrow after we transgressed. And it became near impossible to be able to reach that inheritance that was set for us. But now, through Yahushua, we have another path. But he had to go through these things so we could gain access to that. Verse 6, all we like sheep have gone astray, right? So the visual is like the sheep that are, scattering, running in every which way. And that was the condition from when Isaiah was saying what he was saying all the way up until Yahushua came on the scene. And that's why Israel was constantly likened onto the lost sheep. That's why he said that. But go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, because Yahushua, being the shepherd, knew that his main priority was to gather the lost sheep, right? To teach that word. We have turned every one to his own way, right? Turning away from the path of the Lord and going every which way. So you had some Israelites that didn't know they were Israelites. You had some that knew they were Israelites, but were still living after the customs of the heathen. You had some that knew they were Israelites of the circumcision, but inwardly they were being wicked. So you had Israelites that had deviated from the path of the Lord and gone in every which way. And the Lord Yahweh hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. And that's what he did. We went up on the cross with our iniquity and nailed that to the cross. Verse 7, he was oppressed, right? Or in other words, he was pressed. And when you're pressed, it's like let me actually look into the word here. Maybe they'll give some good synonyms for it that can give a better description, right? To press, to oppress, right? Exert, demanding pressure. That was the word I was looking for. Pressure, to be under, heavy pressure, right? To oppress, to be hard pressed. And that's why it said that Yahushua was acquainted with grief, because he was pressed. He was constantly under this great deal of pressure with the task that was put upon him, right? The burden that he had to bear. Yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter. And when it says he opened not his mouth, we know, right, when Yahushua was on the scene, that he taught. And even during when they asked him those questions during his interrogation, he did speak. But open not his mouth is to say that Yahushua, when you look at how his trial went, he wasn't trying to justify himself, right? And he wasn't trying to necessarily plead a case to defend himself, because he knew that was something he had to do. And it wasn't, Yahushua understood that this isn't like a carnal misunderstanding. This is something that is arranged in the spirit. And this is just how it's manifesting in the carnal realm. So it's not that, you guys have wrongfully accused me, and so this is wrong and I need to stop this. No. It was set up in the spirit that I had to come and be a sacrifice. But the way that story played out in the flesh was through this. Okay, so it's not something that the Lord was even desiring to try and plead a case and say, and defend himself and all of this. And no. And that's why he told Peter to get behind him when Peter tried to be adverse to the Lord having to endure what he had to endure. And so when you look at a sheep or a lamb or an animal, when it is afraid or is threatened, it cries out. That crying out is likened onto a defense, because sometimes they'll try to, if they have teeth or they have claws, they'll try to use that, but they make a sound, right? Especially with like more helpless animals like lamb and so on, they'll just cry out, and that crying out is their defense. They open up their mouth to cry for help. But Yahushua wasn't crying for help, because he understood that this was a mission he had to do. This is something he had to accomplish. He had to fulfill this. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as sheep before her shearers is dumb. Shearers are those that, for lack of a better word, shave off the fur off the sheep, which is then used for like wool and thread and all those things. So he opened not his mouth, right, which is reiterating the point we just discussed above. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people was he stricken. Now I'm going to pull this up in the NLT. It makes it a bit clearer. Unjustly condemned, he was led away. No one cared that he died without descendants. Now there's another translation that also words it as, who can speak of his descendants? Because he didn't have any, right? His when he came on the earth, he played a role and he was put to death. That's why it says he was cut off out of the land of the living. So, you're not going to be able to go and say, oh, I'm looking at the genealogies and I see, Yahushua was the son of Joseph, but then he had this child and that child and that child. That wasn't the case. So who shall declare his generation or his descendants? None, right? In at least in the flesh. For he was cut off out of the land of the living, for the transgression of my people was he stricken. Right, which goes to show you that that's why the Lord came. And when you think about that, to lay down your life, not just to die, but to go through that whole entire process. It was humiliation, it was pain, it was slow, it was tiring, it was stressful. And to go through all of that by yourself, nobody could go through that with him. He had to go through it by himself for somebody else or for others. And then on top of that, these people are mocking you at the same time. That is not an easy thing to do. And he made his grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. Right? And once again, I'll pull this first part up in the NLT. He had done no wrong, and he had never deceived anyone, but he was buried like a criminal. He was put in a rich man's grave. See, so Yahushua's death and, leading up to his burial, it was to the unknown mind, they would think this was just another criminal, right? That's suffering the penalty of a criminal, right? To be crucified. He's hung up there with criminals, and then they're gonna bury him, right? But as it says, and with the rich in his death, when we look this up in the in the NLT, it mentioned he was buried in a rich man's grave, which shows you the accuracy of prophecy. And this is why, when we go to Matthew, the 27th chapter, this is why the Lord put the spirit on Joseph of Arimathea to do what he did here. And that would fulfill what Isaiah mentioned. When the even was come, right? This is after Yahushua was crucified. When the even was come, there came a rich man of Arimathea named Joseph, who also himself was Yahushua's disciple. He went and to Pilate and begged the body of Yahushua. Then Pilate commanded the body to be delivered. So you see what's going on here? The Lord, because this was prophesied, it had to happen. And the Lord put the spirit on, Joseph, being a disciple of the Lord, to go and do this. And at the same time, the Lord put the spirit on Pilate to actually say, okay, fine, give him the body. And when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out in the rock. And he rolled a great stone to the door of the sepulchre and departed. You see, and that was, let me see what John has to say about that. Okay, and that was back in Isaiah 59 and 9, right, as we read, and with the rich in his death, which in the NLT is clear as it mentions he was buried in a rich man's tomb, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yeah, and Yahushua was pure when he came on the scene. The scriptures say that he was without sin, right? And that proves all the more why, because why would the Heavenly Father have one that is without sin go through something like this? Because the purpose wasn't, the main purpose of Yahushua going through this wasn't, hey, you're wicked, I'm punishing you, but it's you are literally sent on the earth for this purpose. When you compare this to an actual lamb, there are certain animals whose purpose in their life is to be a sacrifice. When you you go back to the Passover, for example, you would pick out the lamb, and then you would separate it, and then for however long the scriptures require, and then the time of the Passover, you would kill it. Guess what? That lamb, whichever lamb ends up getting picked, that was its purpose when it was born, and the Lord had it, be fed by its mother and chew the cud and all of those things. Its purpose was to become that sacrifice for that particular year, for that particular event. Okay? And that's why it mentions that he had done no violence, and yet he had to suffer this. Verse 10, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He hath put him to grief. Now, in bruising Yahushua, it's not that the Lord is like a sadist. I believe that's the right word, sadist. Right, a person who derives pleasure, especially sexual gratification, from inflicting pain or humiliation on others. The Most High is not a sadist. But when it says it pleased him to bruise Yahushua, it wasn't that, oh, I just love to see my son suffer. But in seeing Yahushua go through that was to fulfill the Lord's will. So the Lord was pleased in the fact, or in the obedience of his son, to accomplish the mission, to accomplish the plan. All right. So the pleasing of the Lord came in the fact that part, that prophecy, that plan, that will of his was done. He hath put him to grief. When thou shalt make his soul an offering for sin, and that's what he did, right? Yahushua was likened unto an offering. In fact, he was offered up for our behalf. He shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days. Now we know Yahushua didn't have physical, offspring, but this starts with the spiritual offspring. I believe there's a precept, I want to see if I can find it, where Yahushua is referred to as, I don't know if it's, let's see if it's everlasting Father. But there's a precept where Yahushua is referred to as, here it is, Isaiah 9:6, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty Power, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Okay, it doesn't mean that Yahushua is the Most High. Okay, but he is also likened onto, as it says, he's the first among many brethren, and the first begotten. But we're also likened onto the spiritual offspring of Yahushua. So that seed that he shall see starts with those that believe on him, right, through what he did, right, by being that sacrifice, going on that cross. Or you can say, in other words, his spiritual seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord Yahweh shall prosper in his hand. Right, because ultimately after what Yahushua did, he was raised back up to live forevermore. Right, made eternal to receive that glory that, as he said, he had with the Father back in the beginning. And the pleasure of the Lord Yahweh shall prosper in his hand, because he ended up, as I mentioned above, completing and fulfilling the will of the Heavenly Father, which pleases the Lord, right, when you do his will. And Yahushua didn't falter in doing that. Verse 11, he shall see the travail of his soul and shall be satisfied. Going back to the point we read up above about it pleasing him to bruise Yahushua, because by seeing that the travail of his soul and being satisfied, he is satisfied in what it accomplished, right? In what the sacrifice of Yahushua actually accomplished. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many. Right. So how are we justified? We're justified through the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding which was unlocked by Yahushua. Okay, and by what he did, by not only his teaching and his doctrine, but also the spirit that he unlocked to go with it. And that justification comes by way of understanding the truth. Right? There's let's see why it's on to This is 2 Timothy 3 and 15. And that from a child thou hast known the holy scriptures, which the Yahushai, or the scriptures themselves, mention that Yahushai comes in the volume of the book, because it is written of him. So thou hast known the holy scriptures, which are able to make thee wise unto salvation through faith, which is in who? Yahushai HaMashiach. Right? So that is how we are justified. That is how the many, which are the elect, the believers on Yahushai, are justified by his knowledge. For he shall bear their iniquities. And by doing so, the Lord wouldn't impute that iniquity upon them. That's why they would be justified through the blood of Yahushai. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. And what this is signifying is him being in a high position. Because when you deal with dividing the portion or the spoil, you think of maybe men of war, right? You've gone to war, you won, you got the spoil, Now, those that get the greatest share are really those at the captain or the people in the highest position. They get the greatest share, the first dips, so to speak. So dividing him a portion with the great and dividing the spoil with the strong means that he's one of the top dogs, right? He's in that top position. So he gets the preeminent share. And we know that, right? The Lord is, pretty much everything is under Yahushai, save the Most High. And the Lord, the Most High, made it that way. Because he hath poured out his soul unto death. So because Yahushai was able to do that, and nobody else could do that, he has attained a glory and a position and a rank that nobody else can attain. And he was numbered with the transgressors. When you read about what he went through and the process of his death and so on, he was treated as a criminal, right? And even when he was on the cross, he was in between two malefactors. Okay, so they looked at him as that. In fact, they actually said they preferred Barabbas, which I think he was a murderer, if I remember correctly, over Yahushai. All right, so he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many and made intercession for their transgressors. Or for the transgressors, which are Israelites. And intercession is basically to plead on one's behalf, right? And that's what the Lord is doing, even till this very day. But the ones who he is truly pleading on their behalf is the elect, because the rest of the nation, their justification or their mercy is relative. By the Lord pleading for or I should say transitive, right? Because by the Lord pleading for the elect and the elect being delivered, that would then, bring forth the rest of the nation through the loins of the elect. So they would also still be saved and still be delivered. Okay. So anyway, with that brings us to the end of the book of Isaiah, the 53rd chapter. Lord willing, this was edifying to the elect. In closing, I want to give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahasham, Yahushai, Bahasham, Recha Kodash. And until next time, Shalom.